I think this is our 22nd session, and it's the last session that we have before we go into kind of a summer hiatus. And I have to say, I mean, it's important to honor the audience. I appreciate the fact that I see so many people here who have been attending these sessions. I live in Menlo Park, so I appreciate what it takes to drive up here early in the morning. And I do appreciate it. It's nice to see this. I mean, I think it's too soon to call our program a tradition, but I do think it's an established program and one we definitely get a lot of credit for here at Wharton for putting this on. We are actively in planning mode for the next series of sessions in the fall. I have a lot of interesting ideas and some potential speakers. If you guys have ideas or speakers that you think would be worthwhile to put up before a crowd that's largely entrepreneurial in outlook, please let me know, because we're actively in planning mode right now. Let's see, so Herb Faulkner, just housekeeping. Herb Faulkner's not here today, so we won't have this after-event session with questions regarding startup companies. Also, we do have a webcast audience for each of these sessions. We're trying to be attentive to their needs, so we're doing it. If there are people in the webcast audience who have questions, it is possible to type your questions in and send them, and I will see them and I'll relay them to our speaker. In addition, we're trying to stay with a protocol that if you guys have questions in the audience and ask them of our speaker, we will make sure that we repeat those questions so people in the webcast audience can hear as well. So let me introduce our speaker, Rowan Chapman, who has been a partner with Mohr Davidow Ventures for 10 years. Some of you may recognize Rowan. We had a panel here about a month ago collaborating with QB3 over Mission Bay. We had a panel of 4 speakers on that talking about in-licensing of core IP from the university. It was a very interesting discussion. Rowan was on that panel wearing the hat of the investor, and she did a fantastic job. And consistent with our culture here, no good deed goes unpunished. So I called Rowan and asked her if she would be willing to present on generally in the area of life science and biotech companies, and that's where we are today. At least that's probably half the presentation. So as I say, Rowan has been a partner at Mohr Davidow Ventures, which is a very highly regarded venture capital firm based on Sand Hill Road. It's just a wonderful firm. Prior to being a venture capital person, Rowan was in the business development side, a very successful run at a pharma company called Rosati Informatics, and she also has a PhD in cellular and microbiology. So we are delighted to have Rowan with us today. Please join me in welcoming her. Rowan, thank you.
Thanks, Doug. So when Doug gave me a call, he said, Rowan, will you give a presentation, something in the healthcare for entrepreneurs? And he said, something that's kind of topical, maybe a little controversial. And I thought, how about investing in healthcare versus technology? That's a conversation that a lot of people are having right now. And I think there's a lot of conventional wisdom out there, old wives' tales, but there's also data. So I thought this was a terrific time to actually bring together some of the assumptions with some of the data and try and put it in a presentation. As you'll see, it's comparisons, contrasts, and commentary. I always also view it as conversations, so I really would appreciate questions during the presentation. And let's make it more of a conversation rather than me standing up giving you a lecture. So I wanted to start off, before getting into the contrast and comparisons, with a little bit of background about the venture industry and the returns that we've seen over the last 15 years. As you'll see with this graphic, by the way, the 2 colors are because it comes from 2 different data sources. Pulling these data together are actually quite difficult, and I have to thank my partner, Abbas, who's here in the audience, for really helping me with this. So you see, over time, we have this tremendous peak in the late 90s in the venture returns, and I think we all know what that is due to. That's the internet bubble. And then the returns have fallen back down to basically a real low in 2001, then back up to the early 90s over the last 10 years. What I thought was interesting is to say, well, these are the returns. Well, let's take a look at the investment in venture capital overlaid with those returns. As you can see, investment follows returns very nicely. Unfortunately, for the people who invested in 2000, the returns fell immediately that they made their investment. So you can see that there was gradually increasing investment over the late 90s, and there's been a reasonable amount of investment in the 2000s into venture capital firms. Another statistic is when you look at the number of firms. On the first blush, you look at this graph and say, oh, the number of funds actually maps the amount of capital invested. I think there's a more subtle point that is interesting from this graphic, is if you have a look here, the number of funds here relative to the amount of capital is higher. So this means there's a large number of funds with less capital per fund compared to here where you have larger funds. So we look at these statistics and say, oh my goodness, maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, what does it all mean? And then you have all of these fantastic exits. I'm using recent exits over the last year and a half, and you look and say, wow, 500x return, that's fabulous. And it's these kind of exits which are really driving investment into venture capital. Because you see these kind of companies and you say, I want to invest in those. And that's what limited partners want to do. Can Amy tell me, I think this is an easy, a sort of easy ball to throw you. What industry are these all in? Tech? What kind of tech? Consumer digital tech. And these are really the high-profile returners recently that has been returning money to venture capital. Now, while tech's the darling, life sciences is not so much the darling at the moment because we have a whole set of venture capital firms who are saying, I don't want to do life sciences anymore. I'm going to get out of it. And this is in comparison. And this is what's in everybody's mind. And I honestly get asked that question all the time. So life sciences, why would anybody invest in life sciences when we could invest in Facebook? So before I go into a discussion and commentary on that question, I want to give you a little bit of background about Mohr Davidow, the firm where I'm a partner. So we've been investing for 29 years. We have almost $2 billion under management. We're a largish fund, so our current fund that we're investing is above 600 million. But we invest across the 4 different areas of B2B2C, consumer, web, mobile, social, clean tech, and health tech. So we invest across the board. One thing that's kind of unusual about Mohr Davidow is that we don't separate those teams into our own fiefdoms. We actually bring all the teams together in a room every Monday. So I, from the life sciences side, I get to see the consumer tech deals. I get to see the hardware IT. I get to see the clean tech. We have the discussions, and I thought it might be interesting to share with the audience really how we think about investing across the board. Well, the first thing we do is we're always looking for themes, as every venture capital is, and this is the current theme of the day, is really big data converging in the cloud, which is relevant across all of the areas. And I think that one thing that's unique, so a company where I'm on the board of Personalis is a company which is data analytics on healthcare data. I've got this question about the board meeting, and I'm like, okay, I know you can do that cheaper. So I just, in terms of the compute infrastructure, so I introduce those folks to the big data guys on the IT side, and they can have a conversation about, no, you can do it cheaper, and you can upload the data to the cloud in a faster, more efficient way. And that's really, I think, the power of convergence. So how do we make investment decisions? Well, there's some universal investment criteria for every single company. They have to be great entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs that you feel you can work with. They don't necessarily have to be serial entrepreneurs, but they have to be people with a passion in their belly who are going to drive through walls. They have to be large markets with unsolved problems. And that can fit in 2 categories, and we have a very active discussion. Is this a large market that this is a replacement, a faster, cheaper, better? Or is this a large market that we believe is a large market, but it isn't necessarily a large market today? Very important conversation to have, because the risk profile is kind of different when you're investing in one versus the other. We like to have enabling technologies and intellectual property, but as you'll see, depending on the business, intellectual property may or may not be valuable. And obviously, we say we like capital-efficient financing strategies. You'll hear that from every venture capitalist. It's not always true, but you'll hear that. So when we look at the startups, we don't really divide them into IT, clean tech, life sciences. We divide them by business model. And on the left-hand side, so what we try to do with this slide is really sort of pull the business models apart into categories. So on the left-hand side, it's really sort of the B2B business model. The IT software, traditional IT hardware, and often the life science tools actually fit into that category. And I've given you here are some examples of companies that MDV has invested in. And these are companies which really are valued in the end on an enterprise sales model. So they're really valued on their revenue ramp, the type of revenue that they can gain, and it's a longer sales cycle than any of the other categories. The middle category touches the consumer somehow, B2C, B2B2C. And there's a whole set of companies that you know, both on the life sciences side, there's a clean tech company, on the IT side, that somehow reach the consumer. These companies tend to have lower price points and shorter sales cycles. Again, this is the law of averages, so there will always be points where you can say that's not right, but it's the law of averages. And they tend to be valued on adoption. Sometimes they're valued on revenue ramp, and sometimes they're valued on adoption. It kind of depends on what the company is doing. And then you have these set of companies which I'll call the concept companies, which tend to be valued pre-sales. And this is where therapeutics, medical devices, and concept clean tech fits in. And these are often acquired before you have sales at all. So when you're looking at the valuation and potential exit of these kind of companies, it's really around what's the strategic value of this asset to some company, normally an M&A, out in the marketplace. So this is how we view the startups and how we categorize them. On average, I'd say some of the IT companies tend to fit here on the left two categories. Some of the clean tech companies tend to fit in the right two categories. But life sciences, you get all the way across, and I've given examples. Raindance is a tool, which is really a B2B tool, which is a life science tool that can be sold into diagnostic companies, into big pharma, etc. Health Tap is really consumer health. It's doctors answering questions for consumers online. So that's a sort of IT life sciences type deal. And here, these are straight therapeutics deals, but therapeutics with very specific reduced regulatory risk from our perspective. Doug?
Is it okay to ask questions?
What did I say at the beginning?
Sorry. And you'll have to repeat the question.
I will.
But as you look at these different categories of companies, does Mohr Davidow think about them in terms of what the all-in investment capital is as part of the equation? I mean, is it possible to average how much capital has to go into each of those three categories?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's the question was, does Mohr Davidow look at these categories in terms of total capital required over time, and is it different between the categories? So the way we view it is every time we make an investment, we look at the total amount of capital required over time. On average, some of these companies can require more capital over time, but we're very careful and try not to invest in companies that are going to take, $50 million in capital, because we don't have the size of fund that can do that. If you're in the kind of $2 billion fund, you can, but we're not in that category. When we look at these kind of companies, we're really trying to say after $20 million in capital, is this something that could be acquired? And I'm going to get a little bit more into the capital requirements across the spectrum, but I don't want to put an average amount per company. These ones tend to be less capital in before you decide on success, that's for sure. So key investment differences between the categories. I've given you some investment similarities or boxing them into different categories. But what we think about is what's the key hurdle? How are you going to define success in each of these categories? At which point are you going to say, yes, I have a valuable company? One thing I should have said is we invest early, so we really think very hard about how is success going to be defined. On the B2B side, a key hurdle is revenue. Sometimes we'll invest in the companies when they're already in revenue, but being able to see a revenue and a steady revenue ramp and a proof of sales cycle is incredibly important for this kind of company. In the middle, the key hurdle is adoption. As you know, some of the consumer companies, Instagram, the one that I talked about earlier, no revenue, but that's a company where the reason they were acquired is because they had terrific adoption. So we really look at the adoption with the B2B and B2B2C. And if we're going to invest before they have proven adoption, that had better be at the seed level or at a very inexpensive valuation. With these companies, particularly on the life science side, the key hurdle is regulatory. And that's a barrier to entry compared to other companies. But we have to understand what's the regulatory approach for that company and when are they going to have some kind of FDA approval or some barrier. Monetization is different. Monetization in the B2B is often immediate or near term. It's bimodal in the B2C. Either you're going for adoption or you're going for money. It's either in that category. And very rarely are we looking at straight direct monetization in the right-hand category. The capital needs are different, and it's really it's sort of different in the timing of the capital needs. So I'm going to take the middle one, which is the mobile and consumer tech. Often requires very low capital initially, but requires much higher capital later when you're really ramping and pushing towards the consumer. I mean, Facebook, terrific example of a company that had low capital to prove adoption, but then a lot of capital went into Facebook to really push the consumer side. On the left-hand side in this B2B category, it can be moderate at discovery, but you really need to build a sales force in that category, and that can be expensive. On these pre-sales, it can be substantial. And I would say in the sort of ramp, it's more of a, I'm actually right-handed, so I'm doing things with my left hand, so it takes a moment. So with the capital requirements over time in the pre-sales model can look a little bit more like this. More capital initially, but the ramp is less, whereas with the consumer type ones, less capital initially with a big ramp towards the end. And the domain expertise is very different between these. You really need great technology across all of them. But here you're really looking at the sales and technical, because it's a sales model we're looking at. Here it's about regulatory and deep science. And here it's about getting with the trends, understanding what the consumer is going to do. Intellectual property, which we didn't put on this slide, is different across them. Tends to be a lot of intellectual property in this area, moderate intellectual property in this area, and very little intellectual property in this area.
Rowan, a question. Some of your competitors, venture capital firms, who traditionally did startups, have started to devote more of their funds to later stage investing. Are you guys doing much of that, or is it basically you invest later in companies you're already involved with?
So the question was really around the stage of investment, and Jim was asking me whether we're diversifying from early stage investment to late stage investment. And I think the answer to that depends on the field. And I'm going to have a slide later, so maybe I can come back to your question on that later. So I've shown you this is all assumptions, hypothesis. I'm actually going to show you some data now that I managed to pull from the industry. And I thought this was an interesting paper that some of you may have seen, some of you may not have seen. I want to use a couple of examples from it. And this comes from Bruce and Bijan, both life sciences investors. And they basically got fed up a couple of years ago about getting beaten down about healthcare investing. So they said, let's go and look at the data. Pulled out a couple of the statistics. So between the years 2000 and 2010, this is what the data shows on IRR across the different segments of the industry. As you see, healthcare outperforms all of the other segments in realized and the realized and unrealized, massively outperforms the other segments on the IRR. And electronics actually does pretty badly. This may be a surprise to you, it may not be a surprise to you, but it isn't out there in the conventional wisdom. And I guess it was published in Nature Biotechnology, which not a lot of tech investors read, I wouldn't think. However, this is where the tech investors come back and say, hey, but look at the 90s. So this is the 1990s versus the 2000s. And as you can see, tech really beats life sciences in the 1990s. These red bars are the IRR in all the areas of technology. So the ratio between the 1990s for the technology side and the 2000s is massive. Less of a divergence in ratio in healthcare. And I would say just about everything did better in the 1990s than the 2000s. The only thing that actually did worse in the 1990s was pharmaceuticals and did better in the 2000s. So this is the sort of bimodal characterization of distributions. You've got healthcare, which did better in the 2000s, and tech, which did better in the 1990s. And that was, I showed you that graph. That was that peak on the average venture capital returns. So this is a slide which I got from my friends at Correlation Ventures. And I think it's an incredibly interesting slide. As you see, I put no key on it because I'm checking to see whether you're listening at this time in the morning. So I've got 3 categories here. This is the venture capital returns in 3 buckets. I've got traditional tech, I've got healthcare, and I've got, the category is called other, and that includes digital consumer, mobile. And I'm going to do a check. Can anybody tell me what the red line is? No, you're not listening. Tech, yay, traditional tech. What's the blue and what's the green? I'll show you the categories. So tech, that's the peak in the 1990s. Healthcare, as you'll see, had a little peak in the 1990s and has actually outperformed everything else over the last 10 years. And this is multiples versus IRR, but the two appear to be correlated. And the other, which includes all the social, mobile, consumer, actually done moderately, and as you see, we're getting this little peak. Look at the date, 2010, little peak coming up in 2010. I decided to put this slide in because nobody's ever heard of the healthcare successes. And these are all over the last 12 to 18 months. And you look at the numbers, these are actually pretty decent venture returns. And this is covering a variety of different types of health tech investing. We have Micromet, classic drug discovery, pretty good return, I'd say, for the investors. This hasn't got a great IRR because this was over 8 years. Ion Torrent, that was over 2 years, that return, pretty good return. And that was 0 revenue when it was sold for $720 million. And that's in the life science tools. So this one fits in the B2B. This one fits in that right-hand category, which is the pre-sales model. Ascend Health is a health IT company. Again, I believe that was when I looked at the data, it was a 15x return for the investors. iTriage, I put this one in. Not very high acquisition, $75 million. But that was in an incredibly short period of time. And that one really fits in the kind of consumer social. That's one where it's an iPhone app. So I think that's a pretty good return for an iPhone app. They didn't take much investment. And Plexicon, again, fits in the right-hand category of the pharmaceutical development. They're not household names, though. So I've given you a set of data. I've given you data that suggests that tech investing in the boom times is significantly better than life science investing. And I've given you a set of data that said in life science investing, actually out of the boom times, does better than any of the other categories. So what's the industry response to all of this? Well, LP investments in the life sciences are frankly mixed right now. There's a set of firms, these are highly publicized, which are saying, we're not going to do life sciences anymore, or we're going to go later, to your question, Jim. So scale is all about investing later. There's also a set of recently raised life sciences funds, pretty decent sized funds that are saying, no, we're doubling down in healthcare. This is the right place to do. This is the right place to be. There are, when you actually start subsetting life sciences, there is one particular sector that is actually the investment is decreasing in that area. And this is in medical devices and equipment. So if you look at this graph, over time, I think there is a decline on the green side is medical device and equipment, and the red line is more of the therapeutics investing. And there is this decline, and that's because the average amount in the M&A has actually gone down significantly in med device because there's been consolidation in the industry, therefore less competition to buy med device type equipment. This is a different way of, again, looking at med device versus healthcare overall. So I thought this was an interesting slide, which again I got from Bijan, who was one of the authors of that Nature Biotechnology paper. He said, Rowan, go and look at the distribution of the multiples between the different categories. So what you can see is healthcare distribution between 2000 and 2010 skews higher than either IT, internet, or medtech. And so what you've got in the less than 1x category, you've got skewing downwards from IT, internet, and medtech. So this is what kind of drives medtech down and drives life sciences in general up, that you have a higher skewing towards the 1 to 5x category. Above 5x, it's interesting to note they're all similar in terms of percentages. And again, this is kind of unexpected data, but it's what you get when you start digging in. So what about the current investment ecosystem? So just to remind you, a company gets started. Often on the life sciences and clean tech side, it's had some funding from academia, had some NIH grants, SBIR grants. On the digital side, often doesn't have any academic background or academic funding. You have some angel investment, much more angel investment in the IT side than the life sciences side. Then come the VCs, people like ourselves, growth capital, public markets. All the way along, they're strategics. I think the VC, we've got different pressures in different directions depending on the industry. So let's just think about medtech for a moment, medtech, life sciences. We have pressure from the public markets and the growth because, as you know, the public markets haven't performed that well over the last 10 years. And we have pressure downwards in valuation, which actually pushes the valuation of these things down all the way down to the academic. And that's tough for life sciences entrepreneurs, but the valuations are going down. On the other side, on the IT and digital social side, tremendous pressure from angels. The number of angels is increasing 20% year over year in the IT side. And these guys are pushing valuations up. And I can tell you, it's the deals that the angels are doing are unpriced, which is really hard to compete with, unpriced deals with very few discounts. And I personally think there's a little bit of bubble going on the digital side, particularly with the fact that the deals are unpriced, uncapped. And I don't think it actually helps the angels that much. And there's a growing role of strategics, particularly in the life sciences sector. There's emergence of a lot of M&A as exits in the life sciences sector. And the strategics, nearly all the big strategics are actually coming downstream and investing and almost becoming venture capitalists. So it's actually good for the venture capitalists because suddenly the ecosystem of co-investing partners is very good in the life sciences because the strategics are stepping in. So I'm going to talk about strategies for evolution, and I'm going to focus more on life sciences in what I think are strategies for evolution, but I'd love your ideas for strategies for evolution too. So one, focus on capital efficiency, and that's back to your question, Doug, and your question, Jim. Here's a couple of examples where there's been a definitive statement. We're going to focus on capital efficiency. So Arresto, this is a company that was invested in by one of my colleagues on Sand Hill Road. I believe it was a 7x return in just over a year. And it was a capital efficient drug discovery model where they chose a very small team and did kind of a virtual biotech. Velocity Pharmaceutical Development is a fund set up by CMEA to do exactly the same. What their model is, they say, we're going to take 5 excellent drug developers, and I think their tagline is, we develop drugs, not build companies. And they're basically taking assets, taking that 5 expensive senior management, and diversifying them across a set of different virtual companies to develop the drugs and then do M&A, sell them on. So they're very focused on capital efficiency. It's another one, fail early and often. Now, this is one where I've been scratching my head because it is conventional wisdom that the best way in venture capital is to fail early and often. I don't have the exact data slide that I want, but I'm actually going to get hold of it because I want the data slide. What I'm interested in is how often do you what's the graph look like from seed investment through to exit, and how often do you fail across the different sectors at what stage? And my guess is that on the digital side, you're going to be failing very early after like $2 million. In the life sciences side, you're going to have less failure that early. This is the best data I could get for now, which is actually a rate of loss between 2000 and 2009. Tremendous rate of loss in the IT, less rate of loss in the life sciences. This may or may not prove my point. I'm not sure. There's the other opportunities are maybe do late-stage investing. By late stage, I'm not actually talking late stage in valuation. I'm just saying invest when more risk has been reduced. And that's certainly something that strategics are looking to do in partnership, is choose slightly later stage assets and take advantage of the slightly depressed valuations. I think that's actually a smart approach. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is maybe combine technology and healthcare. And I want to give you some examples, and I have to give all the credit to my partner Abbas, who has been out in the ecosystem, working with IT entrepreneurs, healthcare entrepreneurs, to really pull together some interesting data. So first of all, the global healthcare technology trends. I bet you've never seen a slide like this before. You've seen the global technology trends. First of all, providers are adopting technology like mad. How old is the iPad? A few years old. It's about 40% of physicians now have an iPad in their hand. And that's not just to do with the fact that physicians are in that socioeconomic part of the ecosystem. They actually find it genuinely useful in communicating with their patients. Tremendous push from the government on data access. They're releasing data about healthcare and allowing people to do predictive modeling on outcomes and seeing what actually makes a difference. A lot of innovation acceleration. We're investors actually in Rock Health, which is a local digital health incubator, which is bringing tech and life sciences together to try and use technology, frankly, to solve life sciences problems. Nice thing about life science markets is we all get sick, so they don't go away. Consumer devices, a lot of interest, and I know that many of you will, maybe some of you are wearing Fitbits right now, I don't know, but there's a tremendous interest there. And of course, connectivity. We all expect to reach our doctors like that. The government is also putting money behind it. Remember, in life sciences, government funding is traditionally very important. This is where the government's putting money. And the ecosystem is growing. The angels, the seed funds, the VCs, and strategic partners all the way from the IT to the, these are the health insurers. And they're all looking at this, they're making acquisitions, they're stepping into this field because they know something has to change in healthcare. Did you know that most physicians actually send faxes still? So something can change. And this is a time to kind of mention the Affordable Care Act and all of the type of governmental involvement in healthcare. So you can go both ways. You can say, is that going to reduce reimbursement? Probably. The way I view it is like, if you keep the funding flat, there's going to be a lot of shifting in the sands to make sure there's increased efficiency. And that's what I think, honestly, America's good at, is using entrepreneurialism to increase efficiency constantly. I'm going to finish on something a little controversial, in case the other wasn't controversial. And how about investing the upside of both healthcare and tech? I think I've shown you data that says that tech in the boom times is the place to be, and that life sciences in the non-boom times is the place to be. So I'm going to try something on you. So we've seen this slide in a different iteration. And this is what really happened. Computing hardware and internet really drove venture capital returns in the 80s and 90s. And healthcare gave a better return in the last 10 years. Social, and the dotted line, this is now conjecture rather than data, because we're going forward. Social, I think, is the green line, and I think we're going to get a nice peak that's probably happening right now. Don't have the data, won't get it for a year or two. But I think it'll probably come down again, because that's the pattern of what happens in markets. It's cyclical. I think healthcare is going to get a semi-peak from that at the same time, because there's a lot of M&A in traditional healthcare. And I think there may be a peak coming really in the health IT arena. Mobile and consumers coming along. I think that's going to change everything again. Maybe the purple peak's mobile consumer, maybe it's earlier, I don't know. And question mark, what's going to happen next? I don't know. I think the most important thing about this presentation is the different colors of the peaks. Traditional IT had its peak. We've got a whole different area that actually didn't do that well at that time that's coming up. A whole different area coming up. And this is where entrepreneurs have to focus, is rather than looking into the past and say, what was successful in the past, they say, what are the changes that are happening now? And in IT, you may or may not hit that wave, hit that peak. In life sciences, I think you have to take advantage of all of those different technologies, as we've just talked about in the health IT arena, but know that you can get a nice kind of upside or baseline upside in the in-between peak times. So entrepreneurs, go figure out what the next big thing is, and if you're in healthcare, make sure that you're being capital efficient, solving a big problem, and know who's going to pay for it. So I'd like to take any questions now. Yes?
Do you expect the next big things all being produced in the U.S.
So the question was, do I expect the next big things to all happen in the US, or are we looking in the other parts of the world? Good question. So I'm in a fund that invests, it's a US-only fund, so you ask me a broader question than an MDV question. Honestly, I think it's both. I think in the healthcare arena, there's going to be a tremendous amount of innovation coming probably from the US, but in the third world markets, about reducing the cost and increasing the stability of a lot of our diagnostics and monitoring. And I think in infectious disease and vaccines, the Gates Foundation is putting a tremendous amount of money to developing drugs and devices for the third world in maybe not quite as specific or sensitive a manner that we would need in our healthcare system. But I think that technology will then come into the US and be developed to reduce costs in our healthcare system. And that's one where I definitely think it's US money going to the third world that's going to come back and impact us. From the connectivity, we're now completely connected. I think that a lot of companies are outsourcing some of the software development. So.
Thank you.
Hi.
What are your thoughts on the FDA? And there's a lot of talk of lack of transparency and added substantial risk from that.
Okay, question on the FDA, lack of transparency and additional risk. The FDA, as you know, is Food and Drug Administration is responsible for regulating drugs. They're not responsible for regulating lab-based diagnostics at this point in time. So I'm going to separate it out into the two categories. On the drug side, we've certainly found the FDA to be very transparent. The one thing I didn't talk about is that there is, on the direct towards capital efficiency in the drug development side, there is a push towards orphan disease drugs, and the FDA is completely transparent and very helpful in those areas. They want drugs to be developed for areas where where a drug doesn't exist today. If you're talking about another Me Too drug, then it takes a while with the FDA. If you're talking on the diagnostic side, the molecular diagnostic side, the FDA has frankly thrown a wrench and confused the field for a while. That is getting sorted out, and I believe the FDA is going to be regulating some genetic tests that drive choice of a drug, because that's very important because of safety issues, but is going to be much less involved in regulating drugs that help you make a decision, regulating diagnostics that help you make a decision that doesn't involve putting a toxic chemical in your body. Jim.
Rowan, how do you think about strategic investors as you're moving through the different stages of your deals?
Sure.
You know, I've had the experience of, there, as you pointed out, there are a decent number of them now who have real venture capital arms and are interested in making the investments. But what are some of the issues, and I think this is for the benefit of the group, that you sort of think about when evaluating strategic investors?
So the question was, how do we view strategic investors, and what are some of the challenges about working with strategic investors? So strategic investors are unusual because they're not, some of them are in it to make the return, some of them in it to gain access to information, and some of them in it just to gain access to an asset. So the first thing we have to do is try and evaluate what is the role of that strategic investor and why are they interested in that particular company. If they're going to be acting purely on the equity side, the biggest challenge is the strategics. A lot of them have an issue with owning more than 20% of the company, because if they own more than 20% of the company, they have to consolidate it into their financials, and they frankly don't want to. So what you end up with is the strategic then drives a high valuation so that they end up with 19.9% versus 30%. That is not good for a venture capitalist because it's driving us to put money in at the wrong valuation. So we and many other venture capitalists very rarely follow a strategic's valuation. So that's one of the first issues. A second issue is the strategic using this as a way of just doing outsourced R&D and getting equity versus just putting dollars into the research and development of the company? Traditionally, they've put just the dollars into the research and development. So you have to view that. And often what you'll end up with a strategic is saying, you want that program done, you do it as R&D. If you want to give us extra money on top, you can give us a little bit extra in our equity round. And that often happens. The other thing between the strategics is, I mean, I've done an analysis of this. There's kind of 5 different models of strategics, and you really just have to figure out how the strategics who are doing the investment are compensated. Are they compensated on return, or are they compensated on information? Most of the time, the strategics don't get board seats, for example. And if they insist on a board observer seat, you have a board meeting that's cut in 2. You have the first part of the board meeting where they're welcome, and the second part of the board meeting where they're not welcome.
So can I ask a related question? You kind of skirted the issue with this explosion of angels in the investment community. Does that influence you in the way that you look at companies, in the way that you look at deal flow, in the way that you look at the way the capital structure of a company is shaped? How do you look upon the angel community? And this, it seems like this is a question that's a perennial question, but the change in the environment is so dynamic these days, it's worthwhile asking it again.
So a question about how we view angel investors and some of the pros and cons of working with the angel community. So on the pro side, the angel community is connected, they're on the beat, they figure out which companies are hot, which companies are not hot. Tremendously useful. And again, it boils down to people and relationships. Whose opinion do you really trust, and whose opinion don't you trust? There's a variety of angels. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, with a set of angel investors, the cap table can get complicated. So you can end up doing a Series A where there's 20 people on the cap table, and that's really hard from a venture capital perspective moving forward. Much better if there's fewer angels on a deal, frankly. Fewer angels with more money is better than 20 angels with $20,000. A third comment, you may have seen some of our colleagues on Sand Hill Road actually have an angel program where they give money to angels to go invest. So that's certainly been publicized recently. That is a way, frankly, of getting a little piece of every deal, but not having the pressure to follow on, to the fail early, fail often. Different venture capitalists have different models. You don't want to be the venture capitalist that gives a ton of people money and then just chooses one to follow on in, because guess what? People aren't going to come to you later because it's negative on them if you say, oh no, you're not worth investing in anymore. So it's this fine balance between failing early and failing often, with giving everybody the expectations in the market that you're going to invest in them all. So angels are very useful for that. The other challenge, frankly, is on valuation. I think a lot of the angels are not doing capped rounds. And so they don't choose the valuation they want because they don't know at that stage of the company. But it would be, frankly, better for the VCs if the angels put a cap on the round, because sometimes you'll have an angel investor that puts in $100,000 with not a capped round. That round gets done at 10 million pre. That's not a great return for the angels. So hopefully that answers. At the back.
Do you see anybody disrupting the provider market, or do you see them to continue to be kind of the strategic acquisition partners in the next 5 years or so?
Okay. So the question is, and I'm going to ask you a question back because I want to make sure I get this right. So the question is there any disruption happening in the provider market, and what's the strategic implications over the next 5 years? The payer market. And I was going to ask you the question, because provider, what do you mean by provider? The payer market, yes. Well, the payers are in a little bit of a challenge at the moment, frankly, because we have healthcare reform, which is saying that the payers have to provide healthcare to everybody, and it has to be affordable. So what the payers are all doing is trying to figure out how to differentiate from one another. And that's part of the interest in the digital health ecosystem, because they want to provide high quality care to everybody at lower cost. And I think one of the things that's coming along is in the telemedicine arena. We've done a lot of research in this arena. Something like 80% of primary care doctor visits, you don't actually have to go and visit the doctor. You could actually do in a telemedicine type approach by calling the doctor, talking to a nurse, doing a video conference. There's a tremendous amount of interest in technology adoption. I don't know what's going to happen to the payer market, frankly, but I think that what they're all concentrating on is differentiation and making sure it doesn't cost them too much. So, yeah.
Do you see see a difference in return with how involved you are with your investments in terms of the operations?
It depends on the company. So if we do a very early seed stage investment, we often don't take a board seat because a board seat takes time. It takes time and energy. And so at seed stage, we don't tend to do that. With later stage, we're still a fairly involved investor. So the boards I sit on, you know, I'm not just going to the board meetings, I'm doing some things almost every day for those companies. So it depends is the answer.
So in pharmaceutical research and development, you have, because of the regulatory landscape, you have this advantage of watching a drug or a therapeutic go through phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, and you get a chance to pick. You know, you can get in when you're only curing rats, or you can wait until they're actually have an effect in humans. So it's not something that you have in these other arenas. So the ability to get in early with a large return versus wait, because you know that at stage 1, 2, and 3, you know what percentage of these drugs usually make it all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
Can you use that to your advantage? Can you stay on a very, very early development, and do you, or get in a little bit later?
Okay, so the question was, given pharmaceutical drug development, you have a good idea based on past performance in any therapeutic area, what the likelihood of success is as you move through the arena. So, you know, if you've passed toxicology, that's one thing, that's one hurdle. If you've passed phase 2 and you have some preliminary data, and it depends on the disease area, you know, a phase 2 in cancer is normally pretty predictive. A phase 2 in CNS, often less predictive. And the question is, can we use that to our advantage? So you did make a comment about curing rats, and I have to say that mice and rats are the healthiest they've ever been. Plenty of drugs for your pet mouse. So yes, we do use that. So I should have given the background. We don't invest in new chemical entities. We don't invest in drugs that we don't know what the tox profile is. That's just our profile at Mohr Davidow. A lot of the life sciences investors do that. It's just not our area of expertise. When we invest in therapeutics, we invest in compounds where we already know what their safety profile is going to be, and we have very good suggestion of efficacy. We also look at different alternative regulatory pathways. So we don't often do something which is a classic PMA in a kind of trial, say, take cardiovascular, for example, that's going to require 2,000 or 3,000 people before you get to a proof of concept. We don't have the capital, frankly, to invest in those. We invest in a set of therapeutics where we understand the regulatory pathway, we understand the size of trial is going to be smaller. To the fail fast, fail early, we want to fail those companies earlier. So, yes?
What do you see happening, or the impact of personalized medicine?
Personalized medicine. So that's an interesting area. So we have certainly invested, we have 6 companies that we've invested in the personalized medicine space. The personalized medicine is something that's coming, and it's to the payer question. It's going to be here. The FDA is now asking for personalized medicine and biomarker data in all of the clinical trials. So that's something that's happening. And if you look in pharma, there's biomarkers being involved all the way along. The confusion that has been put into the category recently is a regulatory confusion down to, is it going to be regulated and how? And is the FDA going to require huge trials, which are very expensive to do, like drug development trials, but a diagnostic normally gets a lower price in the market. It's a cheaper end product, so you can't afford to spend the money on a huge trial to, in the end, for a cheaper product. We believe that personalized medicine is here to stay, and there's a tremendous amount of M&A interest in that area. And there's some big companies that are getting into it. So Myriad, let's take Myriad Genetics, made a lot of money on the BRCA test, a genetic test for the risk of breast cancer. They're expanding into women's health, into oncology, and into wellness. So they are out there, and they're sitting on a pile of cash, and they're out there acquiring. Life and Illumina, 2 tools providers, they've both saying we're getting into diagnostics, and they're out there on an acquisition spree, trying to incorporate some of these. Roche, with its 5.7 or 6.7 billion bid for Illumina, was about personalized medicine. It was about taking that platform and pushing it into the clinic. This is here to stay, and it all depends on the market.
So I'd ask a question, and I'll frame it as kind of advice to entrepreneurs that ties to maybe a couple points people made earlier. You had a slide a little bit back about the funding ecosystem for entrepreneurs. less money flowing into venture capital as a sector. So venture capitalists have less money to deploy. In your view, does that change what an entrepreneur should be doing in terms of thinking about where to look for funding for their company and how to go about funding it?
So the question here was really related to this slide, and the ecosystem was related to this slide plus the amount of money that's flowing into venture capital. What does this mean for entrepreneurs, and what's the advice for them to get funding? I still think that great entrepreneurs are going to get funded via all of the different people in this ecosystem. If you look at the amount of money in the venture capital industry, it's still significantly higher than it was in the early 90s. More money's going in, and if past performance is any predictor of future returns, I think this green spike that I talked about is probably going to bring more money into certain sectors of the industry. Entrepreneurs are going to have to take a look at what milestones they can reach or what amount of capital. I think one of the biggest challenges is trying to figure out when to take money and how much to be diluted. Unfortunately, in the medtech entrepreneurs, I think it's going to be harder for them to raise capital and they're going to be more diluted. So for those guys, I would suggest they focus on places where you can get academic funding. I can tell you that we are in 3 therapeutics companies in our entire portfolio. Not very many, because we're very, very choosy to the question earlier. All 3 of them have significant amounts of non-dilutive funding into them from government grants, frankly, directly into the company. And that's a way that works for the entrepreneur and works for the venture capitalists. And also shows it's an area where the government is interested in making sure that these drugs are developed. So that's the advice I would give. Yes?
In the path towards getting FDA approval, the intellectual property has a protection in the patent right. However, if you pull a patent in the beginning of your process, you're going to use up to 10 years of that patent protection in the development process to get approvals. I know there's what you want to do is pull your patent when you're approved and you have a drug ready for market. But how do you protect that intellectual property in that interim time?
Yeah, there's different approaches for different companies, and as I mentioned, we don't normally do the straight NCEs because they take so long, and we frankly aren't smart enough to figure out what's going to succeed and what's going to fail in that category. Some people are. With the intellectual property question was, how do you ensure that you have intellectual property protection when drug development takes at least 10 years? So that's the question for the web audience. The answer is, I don't know in new chemical entities. That's why we don't invest in them. With the kind of therapeutics that we invest in, it's a much shorter time through the regulatory pathway. And some of the patent protection isn't just on the chemical structure of that particular compound. There's all kinds of patents that you can do around composition, around dosing, around blood chemistry. So there's a whole set of patents around a particular compound that you can make. But the answer is it's hard. Do you have an idea?
What about the patent pending protection?
Patent pending protection is the question. What about that? We do plenty of intellectual property diligence every time we do it, and trying to figure out whether the patent is actually going to hold up or not. Again, the best diligence we can do, it's not always perfect. So.
Thanks. You made the comment that you invest primarily in U.S. companies, and those probably are some of the bigger companies for pharmaceutical development again. But when you're looking at potential revenue, and it's going to be maybe large chunks of that are going to come from Europe and Asia, and understanding that each of those countries has its own regulatory, its own pricing and reimbursement. I mean, how do you figure out the real value of a pharmaceutical?
So the question is, how do you figure out the real value of a pharmaceutical worldwide? Because worldwide there are different regulatory and pricing pressures. When we invest in that area, what we tend to do is we look at the market and we tend to focus and say, what is your first market? And can a venture return be made in your first market? Frankly, in pharmaceuticals, we're probably not going to be building the sales force. And so we are not looking at the cost of building a sales force in the venture model. When we look at investing, the first market has to be big enough, and the gravy or the icing on the cake is the ability to go into all of the other markets. And that's different if you're talking a life science tool, because frankly, the China, India, Asia, the growth of all of the life science tools companies comes from those geographies. So we look very carefully when we look in those investments at the need in that geography and the ability for a distributor in that geography, and put that into the capital planning.
I really want to know, but there is no really potential investing market for HIV.
So the question is there a potential investing market for HIV? And I think that's a very broad question, and I'm probably not the right person to ask that question of. Because HIV, are you talking about a therapeutic? Are you talking about a diagnostic? Are you talking about chronic disease management? I can imagine from our perspective, we might look at a digital health company that's helping reduce the cost of treating somebody with HIV and making sure they're compliant as just part of a medication compliance program. It's unlikely that we would invest in a novel therapeutic for HIV, because I think there's an awful lot of development in companies like Gilead and GSK, for example, in that area. Around the diagnostic, we're investors in a company called Analyte Health, which is a company which is a condition-specific disease clinic around sexually transmitted diseases. So a company that a person that is worried they may have sexually transmitted disease can anonymously go and get the diagnostic and have treatment from a doctor without visiting their primary care physician. So that's an area which relates to HIV. Doug?
Can I ask you a question again? Could you take it down another level, your observations and insights about the current investment climate that relates to valuing early stage companies? I mean, what's going on, and from a strategic standpoint, how do you see it across different sectors?
So the question is, how do we view valuation of early stage companies across the sectors? So valuation is an art, not a science. Frankly, I wish it was a science, but it's an art. I'm an ex-scientist, so I'm always looking for data. In the digital and social arena, some of it depends on competition. In the life sciences arena, it's easier to do a kind of discounted cash flow kind of model, which is more analytical, but there's so many what's the discount rates going forward that it kind of turns into an art again. I think it's an interesting venture capital firm, I will remark on the folks that I actually borrowed some data from, called Correlation Ventures, and they have a very analytical approach. They're down in San Diego, and they have an approach where they take historical venture capital data and they really crunch the numbers to say, does this deal have the profile of companies that have given big venture capital returns in the past? And it's really around the number of venture capitalists on the board, the amount of money into the deal, how hot the deal was, how much competition, because as you know, the more competition, the increase the price, market economics. So it's hard. I don't have a great answer for you.
So a follow-on question, is there a bubble?
The follow-on question, Doug asked whether there's a bubble. My personal view is I think there's going to be a great return in digital and social over the 2010 to 2012 period. And as I that's my personal response as I predicted on those slides. So. But I don't know whether that means that investing in 2013 is a great idea given the previous experience with the internet. I don't know.
Can I make a comment on Doug's comment here?
Please.
Another data slide which you could draw is the average or median seed valuation over time.
Yeah.
And I've drawn this slide and presented it to my class, and it's really flat for a long period of time. So it doesn't move up and down much.
Yeah.
The seed valuations now are trending upwards slightly, so maybe from 2 million to 3 million. Doesn't sound like much, but in a world where that determines whether it's a good return or a bad return, that's meaningful.
Yeah.
So there's certainly a lot of upward pressure in the seed market.
So
Rowan said it nicely about how that might play out.
Yes. So for the web audience, we had a comment here, which was the seed valuations are putting upward pressure, and the average seed valuation over time has gone from 2 million to 3 million, which may not sound like a big deal, but that actually puts a huge pressure on the market and reduces the average valuations over time. The average multiples over time, sorry.
The return for the people.
The return.
Money.
Yes, I think as a seed investor, it's a tough place to be, honestly.
Yeah.
So.
Can you bring together two of the themes you talked about in terms of, you said certain strategies and certain companies would distinguish the companies that end up at the 1x return versus the 4 to 5x return from your venture capitalist money? What strategies stick out in your mind if those companies did well, or what does the entrepreneurs skew in the tech specifically that help get the better return out?
Okay. So the question here was, what skews the multiple, the percent of companies that have the 1 or 2x return versus the 5x or above return, particularly in the healthcare field? And that's the question. I think the number one answer, and again, this is hypothesis for me because I don't have the data, I think the number one answer is going to be the capital put into the company. I think it really depends on the amount of capital put in the company. So I gave the example of iTriage with less than $10 million in and $75 million out in a very, very short period of time. That wasn't that much capital into the company before they had an exit, but it wasn't a huge exit. But if that company had gone and raised a large amount of capital, it probably would have been a bad return for venture capitalists. The type of deals that give you better return depend on who the strategic acquirer is and how much they need it. Because in medtech and life sciences particularly, it's more about M&A these days than IPO. Doug, again, I'm going to, I have a weapon here.
Well, and we've got more time, so I figured this is like found money. So
I have a weapon.
So there's always, in these days, there's a question about the viability of the public equity markets. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, there are 2 exits. You can sell the company or you can go public. And so I guess my question is, given kind of the uncertainty that continues to surround the viability of the public equity markets for technology, for tech and biotech companies, does that constrain the way you think about investing in your portfolio of companies at an earlier stage?
Let me see if I got the question right. Please correct me if I didn't. So I believe the question was, given the anemic nature of the public markets across sectors, does it change the way we think about investing at what stage?
Early stage.
Yeah, at what stage? At early stage. Does that change the way we think about investing at early stage? The answer is yes and no, depending on the sector. So again, in life sciences, we're very unlikely to do a seed stage deal in these pure life sciences. Very unlikely, because it's going to take an incredible amount of time. And also the valuations at seed stage, to the earlier point, seed stage up to Series A and Series B, particularly in the life sciences, you don't get a big lift in between those different stages of investing. And we're really looking at M&A often in the life sciences market versus going public. So we want to make sure that we're investing late enough so we can have a short enough time to an M&A.
But you're also thinking about who the buyer might be. Is that now part of the equation when you look at a company?
So and the question here was, so you're also looking at who the buyer might be at the time you invest? Absolutely. So but across the portfolio, we have to do that. So when we do an investment memo, we obviously look for as many comps as we can. We look for public market comps. We actually look for comparables across the amount of money raised in a similar company, and there's not always a similar company. And we look at how it fits strategically. And it's not that we're trying to build a company for M&A for a particular strategic. That would be a really bad idea. But we're looking for something that is a strategic asset across many different companies. And so we have to look at that when we make investments. But that's not health tech specific. That's all of the different areas. I mean, let's take an Instagram. We weren't invested in Instagram. I wish we were. Let's take Instagram. I believe that the reason that company was acquired for such a large amount of money is because of Apple. I think that it was an Apple-Facebook thing that was going on there. Because if Apple had acquired Instagram, that would have been kind of an issue for Facebook, because Facebook, one of the biggest applications is around photo sharing. If Apple had then got one of the most popular photo sharing apps that it owned, that might hurt Facebook, hence the valuation. And it's all about having more than one buyer.
So are you saying that Mohr Davidow doesn't subscribe to the early fail-often strategy?
No, I didn't say that at all.
Well, you said you don't invest in seed companies.
I didn't say that. So the question was, does Mohr Davidow... I did not say that. So the question is, does Mohr Davidow not subscribe to the fail early, fail often because we don't invest in seeds? What I specifically said is, it's harder for us to invest in a seed in the life sciences area. We do seed investing all the time. HealthTap, which is a company that I invested in, which is in the consumer health arena, that was a seed investment. We do seed investment all the time. It's harder in a technology-intensive life sciences or technology or clean tech, much harder to do a seed investment in that kind of business versus a business which is going to have a small amount of capital to determine success. So I could have been more specific in my seed comments.
We have time for one more question.
Given all these sectors and returns that you showed over the past 10 years, one line that is missing, interestingly enough, given NPV's interest in that sector is clean tech. Do you think that bubble never happened, or do you think that bubble is yet to happen?
So I believe the question is, what's going to happen with clean tech? Is there a bubble that never happened or will happen? Was that the question?
Yeah.
Perfect. And so we do invest in clean technology, but we've been very specific around the areas where we invest. We haven't done many of the big concept plays, most of them in product companies. And clean tech is a very big term. So I'm going to take an example. Staccato is a company that we invested in, which is in the LED lighting space. We put that in clean tech. It's actually a product company for LED lighting that's a B2B2C, doing incredibly well, basically changing all of our fluorescent lighting to LEDs. That's clean tech. Some people might put that in tech.
So consistent with our protocol, we do try to wind up before 9 o'clock. I'd just like to say this has been a wonderful presentation. It helps me certainly to realize the differences between the different sectors. I think it's been just a tremendous presentation. Please join me in thanking Rowan for being here this morning. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I would actually like to thank Abbas here, who's all here, my partner from MDV, because Abbas gave me a tremendous amount of help in pulling this data together, and I strongly encourage you all to know Abbas.
Great, thank you.